Hello everyone, today we're in comment the 11th chapter of the 4th book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being The Use of the Battle. The text follows: whatever form the conduct of war may take in particular cases, and whatever we may have to admit in the sequel as necessary respecting it, we have only to refer to the conception of war to be conceived of what follows. It's a list. The destruction of the enemy's military force is the leading principle of war, and for the whole chapter of positive action the direct way to the object. 2. This destruction of the enemy's force must be principally effected by means of battle. 3. Only great and general battles can produce great results. 4. The results will be greatest when combats unite themselves in one great battle. 5. It is only in a great battle that a general-in-chief commands in person, and it is in the nature of things that he should place more confidence in himself than in his subordinates. From these truths a double law follows, the parts of which mutually support each other, namely, that the destruction of the enemy's military force is to be sought for principally by great battles and their results, and that the chief object of great battles must be the destruction of the enemy's military force. No doubt the annihilation principle is to be found more or less in other means. Granted, there are instances in which, through favorable circumstances in a minor combat, the destruction of the enemy's force has been disproportionately great, maxen, and on the other hand, in a battle, the taking or holding a single post may be predominant in importance as an object, but as a general rule it remains a paramount truth that battles are only fought with a view to the destruction of the enemy's army, and that this destruction can only be effected by other means. The battle may therefore be regarded as war concentrated, as the center of effort of the whole war or campaign, and the sun's rays unite in the focus of the concave mirror in a perfect image and in the fullness of their heat. The forces and circumstances of war unite in a focus in the great battle for one concentrated utmost effort. The very assemblage of forces in one great wall, which takes place more or less in all wars, indicates an intention to strike a decisive blow with this wall, either voluntarily as assailant, or constrained by the opposite party as defender. When this great blow does not follow, then some modifying and retarding motives have attached themselves to the original motive of hostility, and have weakened, altered, or completely checked the movement. But also, even in this condition of mutual inaction, which has been the keynote in so many wars, the idea of possible battle serves always, for both parties, as a point of direction, a distant focus in the construction of their plans. The more war is war in earnest, the more it is a venting of animosity and hostility, a mutual struggle to overpower, so much the more will all activities join deadly contest, and also the more prominent in importance becomes the battle. In general, when the object aimed at is of great and positive nature, on one therefore in which the interests of the enemy are deeply concerned, the battle offers itself as the most natural means. It is therefore also the best, as we shall show more plainly hereafter, and as a rule when it is evaded from aversion to the great decision, punishment follows. The positive object belongs to the offensive, and therefore the battle is also more particularly his means, but without examining the conception of offensive and defensive more minutely here, we must still observe that, even for the defender, in most cases, there is no other effectual means with which to meet the exigencies of this situation, to solve the problem presented to him. The battle is the bloodiest way of solution. True, this is not merely reciprocal slaughter, and its effect is more a killing of the enemy's courage than of the enemy's soldiers, as we shall see more plainly in the next chapter, but still blood is always its prize, and slaughter its character as well as name. Schlacht, from Schlachten, to slaughter in German. And from this the humanity in the general's mind recoils with horror. but the soul of the man trembles still more at the thought of the decision to be given with one single blow. In one point of space and time all action is here pressed together, and at such a moment there is stirred up with us a dim feeling as if in the narrow space all our forces could not develop themselves and come into activity, as if we had already gained much by mere time, although this time owes us nothing at all. This is all mere illusion, but even as illusion it is something, and the same weakness by which seizes upon the man in every other momentous decision may well be felt more powerfully by the general when he must stake interests of such enormous weight upon one venture. Thus, then, statesmen and generals have at all times endeavored to avoid the decisive battle, seeking either to attain their aim without it, or dropping that aim unperceived. Writers on history in theory have then busied themselves to discover in some other feature in these campaigns not only an equivalent for the decision by battle which has been avoided, but even a higher art. This way, in the present age, it came very near to this, that a battle in the economy of war was looked upon as an evil, rendered necessary through some error committed, a morbid paroxysm to which a regular prudent system of war would never lead. Only those generals were to deserve laurels who knew how to carry on war without spilling blood, and the theory of war, a real business for Brahmins, was to be specially directed to teaching this. Contemporary history has destroyed this illusion, but one can guarantee that it will not sooner or later reproduce itself and lead those at the head of affairs to perversities which please man's weakness, and therefore have the greater affinity for his nature. Perhaps by and by Bonaparte's campaigns and battles will be looked upon as mere act of barbarism and stupidity, and we shall once more turn with satisfaction and confidence to the dress sword of obsolete and must institutions and forms. If theory gives a caution against this, then it renders a real service to those who listen to its warning voice. And may we succeed in lending a hand to those who, in our dear native land, are called upon to speak with authority in these matters, that we may be their guide into this field of inquiry, and excite them to make a candid examination of this subject. Not only the conception of war, but experience also leads us to take a great decision only in a great battle. From time immemorial, only great victories have led to great success on the offensive side in the absolute form, on the defensive side in a manner more or less satisfactory. Even Bonaparte would not have seen the day of Ulm, unique in its kind, if we had shrunk from shedding blood. It is rather to be regarded as only a second crop from the victorious events in his preceding campaigns. It is not only bold, rash, and presumptuous generals who have sought to complete their work by the great venture of a decisive battle, but also fortunate ones as well, and we may rest satisfied with the answer which they have thus opened to this vast question. Let us not hear of generals who conquer without bloodshed. If a bloody slaughter is a horrible sight, then there is a ground for paying more respect to war, but not for making the sword we wear blunter and blunter by degrees from feelings of humanity, until some one steps in with one that is sharp and lops off the army from our body. We look upon a great battle as a principal decision, but certainly not as the only one necessary for war or a campaign. Instances of a great battle deciding a whole campaign have been frequent only in modern times. Those which have decided a whole war belong to the class of rare exceptions. A decision which is brought about by a great battle depends naturally not on the battle itself, that is, on the mass of combatants engaged in it and on the intensity of the victory, but also on the number of other relations between the military forces opposed to each other and between the states with these forces to which these forces belong. At the same time that the principal mass of the force available is brought to that great duel, a great decision is also brought on, the extent of which may perhaps be foreseen in many respects, though not in all, and which, although not only one, still is the first decision as such, has an influence on those which succeed. Therefore, deliberately planned a great battle according to its relations is more or less, but always in some degree, to be regarded as the leading means and central point of the whole system. The more a general takes the field in the true spirit of war as well of every contest, with the feeling and the idea that is the conviction that he must and will conquer, the more he will strive to throw every weight into the scale in the first battle, hope to strive to win everything by it. Bonaparte hardly ever entered upon a war without thinking of conquering his enemy at once in first battle, and Frederick the Great, although in a more limited sphere, and with interests of less magnitude at stake, though the same when at the head of small armies he sought to disengage from the Russians or the Federal Imperial Army. The decision which is given by the great battle depends, we have said, partly on the battle itself, that is, the number of troops engaged, and partly on the magnitude of the success. How the general may increase its importance in respect to the first point is evident in itself, and we shall merely observe that according to the importance of the great battle, the number of cases which are decided along with it increases, and that therefore generals who, confident in themselves of being lovers of great decisions, have always managed to make use of the greater part of their troops in it without neglecting on that account essential points elsewhere. As regards to the consequences, or speaking more correctly of the effectiveness of a victory, that depends chiefly on 4 points: on the tactical form adopted as the orders of battle, on the nature of the country, on the relative proportions of the 3 arms, on the relative strength of the 2 armies. A battle with parallel fronts and without any action against flank will seldom yield as great success in one which the defeated has been turned or compelled to change front more or less. In a broken or hilly country, the successes are likewise smaller, because the power of the blow is everywhere less. If the cavalry of the vanquished is equal or superior to that of the victor, then the effects of the pursuit are diminished, and by that great part of the result victory are lost. Finally, it is easy to understand that if superior numbers are on one side of the conqueror, and he uses his advantage in that respect to turn the flank of his adversary or compel him to change his front, great results will follow than if the conqueror had been weaker in numbers than vanquished. The battle of Leuthen may certainly be quoted as a practical refutation of this principle, but we beg permission for once to say what we otherwise do not like, nor rule without an exception. In all these cases, in these ways, therefore, that the commander has the means of giving battle in a decisive character. Certainly, he thus exposes himself to an increased amount of danger, but this whole line of action is subject to that dynamic law of the moral world. There is, then, nothing in war which can be put in comparison with a great battle in point of importance, and the acme of strategic ability is displayed in the provision of means for this great event, in the skillful determination of place and time, in directions of troops, and in the good use made of success. But it does not follow from the importance of these things that they must be of very complicated and recondite nature. All is here rather simple, the art of combination by no means great. But there is great need of quickness in judging of circumstances, need of energy, steady resolution, a youthful spirit of enterprise, heroic qualities to which we shall often have to refer. There is therefore but little wanted here of that which can be taught by books, and there is much that, if it can be taught at all, must come to the general through some other medium than the printer's type. The impulse towards a great battle, the voluntary sure progress to it, must proceed from a feeling of innate power and a clear sense of the necessity. In other words, it must proceed from inborn courage and from perceptions sharpened by the contact with the higher interests of life. Great examples are the best teachers, but it is certainly a misfortune if a cloud of theoretical prejudices comes between, for even the sunbeam is refracted and tinted by the clouds. To destroy such prejudices, which many a time arise and spread themselves like a miasma, is an imperative duty of theory, for the misbegotten offspring of human reason can also be in turn destroyed by pure reason. So, very important chapter, which von Clausewitz, I must say, he surprised me this time. Not that other times he didn't, but in this chapter he really states certain, thoughts that are connected, in fact, to the use of the battle in the not much just in the strategic sense of it, of the concept, but in what should be essentially used, instrumentally speaking, by the commander, but also by, naturally, the politics standing behind it, right? And it says something devastatingly beautiful in this regard, that if you have listened, really, it's a really empowering speech. Here is almost an exhortation, a warning first, and then properly an encouragement to those, and a prescription, right, to those that really want to understand war, but also and especially to make the proper use of it, not to be confused by the idea that the main battle, the Schlacht here, that is properly the most important moment of war. It's as von Clausewitz puts it here, is war concentrated, right? War here assumes totally the face of violence as it is, right? We've seen that there is a suspension of combat, of course, in every war. Most of the time, during most of the war, troops are not fighting at all. This is the moment for which the war is conceived, right? And von Clausewitz explains us why, on the basis of what he has already demonstrated in previous chapters. It's a bit of a summary, but expressing the necessities for which we should never lose this from our side, not fall into the let's say humanitarian, falsely humanitarian idea that driving away from the main battle is to the great bloodshed is fundamentally the best way of dealing essentially with war in positive terms. On the contrary, it's not, right? And this is the way he explains it. So von Clausewitz, let's simply restart. So the use of the battle, right? He writes, whatever from the conduct of war may take in particular cases, and whatever we may have to admit in the sequel as a necessary respect in it, we have only to refer to the conception of war to be convinced of what it follows, right? So war is fundamentally about these 5 points. Most importantly, 1, the destruction of the enemy's military force is the leading principle of war, right? We have seen why. This comes indirectly, right? It technically, it comes indirectly because the world makes it so. The physical world makes it impossible to have this immediate clash of titans that would exhaust each other at the point, just the survivor remains there. But even in prescriptionally speaking, in this world, this is properly what the ultimate principle is, right? The leading principle proper, the one that makes the whole thing move, to destroy the enemy's military force, right? And here we're talking about complete destruction, right? Destruction in the most physical and moral sense. And for the war, and this is still pertaining to the theory of the art of war, in the sense that von Clausewitz will say later, it's not much about actually killing, right? That's not the point of war, properly, right? But it comes through it, and mostly it's about killing the enemy's moral forces, but the rest comes, with it, also with bloodshed, unavoidably. It says, and for the whole chapter, positive action, the direct way to the object. 2. This destruction of the enemy's force must be principally effected by means of battle, right? So this destruction passes chiefly, right? Or better, say better, because let's be very careful with what it says. Must be principally effected. That is to say, we must do it. It's not a matter of whether we can or can't, but this must be done if we really want to get somewhere with this. It may as well be that there are, in fact, wars that are won without the great battle, or even multiple great battles, but still, here it's a asymptotic view of the wall, right? It's always about the concept that here we could even be fighting a small war, right, where even a single duel technically could be of that level of destruction. 3. Only great and general battles can produce great results, right? So here there is a relation of proportionality. So this is what more or less we were saying, that is, a small war can have, in a small combat, actually, in relative terms, a great importance. 4. The results will be greatest when combats unite themselves in one great battle, right? And this is a bit of a corollary of the first, of the previous one, at least in the sense that, as we have seen in previous battles, in the previous chapters, that of course we should maximize the scale of this battle to be the more effective, because we want really to be more effective at the moment, right? Tendentially, then things can come naturally to avoid this. So it's very important to stress this is theoretical, right? That Von Clausewitz here is saying that, to make the long story short, is that if you really go there for war, that the best way you can prepare is for this enormous battle, right? That has theoretically to commit the whole forces of your own forces as well as the one of the enemy at the fullest. So the things end there, and it's actually something preferable for the both of them, right? Then eventually, in reality, this is not possible. Or at least all this. I mean, at the utmost, it's never possible. But also, bigger battles are rarer at least than other engagements. But there is a valid reason for it, given that reality comes to modify but the reality meant as the physical world proper, and also the moral nature of men, right, to this picture. But tendentially, we should aim for it, because technically, even in reality, this works, right, by scale. So it's not that you can't reach the absolute thing. Okay, so let's not do it. Let's try to avoid the great battle. No, you should avoid a great battle only if there is a valid reason that he's procrastinating for fighting a great battle afterwards in more favorable conditions, right? And you understand that considering how much war changes constantly, this is not easy to attain in the first place. However, 5, it is only in a great battle that the general-in-chief commands in person, and it is in the nature of things that he should place more confidence in himself than in his subordinates. So that, in many ways, this is the great battle is the moment in which the general shines in his individual command ability. And we have seen how important the principle of unity of command is, as much as it is putting together all your forces for the great battle. There is a direct proportionality in it that naturally increases enormously also the burden on the same general, right? As well as puts strains enormously on the whole army. So it's obvious that the more you increase this, and the more it's difficult, and this is exactly what's the limitations of reality are about. But if you are so good at making it anyway, that will pay. So Von Clausewitz then writes, from these truths a double law follows, the parts of which mutually support each other, namely that the destruction of the enemy's military force is to be sought for principally by great battles and their results. We have seen also in the previous chapters what it means. That is, even the single battle may not be so disruptive, but the consequences of it can produce this very strong effect, especially from a moral point of view, to the rest of the enemy forces, and so properly cripple the will, the enemy's will that you are trying basically to destroy, to impose your own on him. And that the chief, he writes, object of great battles must be the destruction of the enemy's military force. Alright. Then he writes, no doubt the annihilation principle is to be found more or less in other means. Granted, there are instances in which, through favorable circumstances in a minor combat, the destruction of the enemy's forces has been disproportionately great. Maxen, he uses as a term here. And on the other hand, in a battle, the taking or holding a single post may be predominant in importance as an object, but As a general rule, it remains a paramount truth that battles are only fought with a view to the destruction of the enemy's army, and that this destruction can only be effected by other means. So if you remember the previous videos from Clausewitz, you realize that here he is summarizing the point that, of course, in battles, the main objective can be a merely like positional one, which is never fully the point, but at least the main one in relative terms could be that, or other objectives that objectively, in fact, excuse me for the the game of words, but are not properly the annihilate, the distraction of the enemy's military force, right? But still, the whole thing still gravitates around that, and especially these objects eventually will produce that result, hopefully, right? And there is also naturally there are the first thing he said actually is that there could be battles in which there is a disproportion between the forces involved and in different ways, and that this can still produce an overwhelming amount of destruction in certain circumstances. So that, let's say, in a single battle you're outnumbered, but you wipe out an enormous amount of enemy's forces. So maybe you even lose the battle, tactically speaking, you inflict the enemy enormous damage. And this is truer, as we have seen also in the previous chapters, as long as you think, as long as we're talking about smaller engagements. I mean, this is more frequent in smaller engagements. In the greater ones, it turns out it is not, right? And it is actually very consistently so. Because at that point, there is a level of attrition, of, even of difficulty in control of certain aspects, that it's just the masses that clash. But paradoxically, that's the most important thing at the end of the day, because that really sums up the whole force. Anyhow. So we have read this, and he writes, the battle may therefore be regarded as war concentrated, as the center of thought of the whole war or campaign. In other words, you're fighting that, not just the campaign, but probably the whole war for that end. That may never come, right? May never actually come to the point you're able to defeat the enemy just because he, appears in enormous mass, just there to be slaughtered, right? And that's why wars also are fought in dramatically different ways, but still, the concept is that through this, deconcentration at this point, given von Clausewitz is talking about concentration specifically speaking of forces, passes through the destruction in detail of this various, scattered forces. It's still, the result is fundamentally the same, just it takes more, and it's more dysfunctional to the both of them in some ways, or at least especially to the one that has not concentrated the forces, which is actually the point. And then he uses this metaphor. He says, as the sun's rays unite in the focus of the concave mirror in a perfect image, and in the fullness of their heat, to the forces and circumstances of war unite in a focus in a great battle for one concentrated utmost of war. Right? And naturally, it's a very ideal view, but still stressing the fact that in absolute terms should be that. Then he writes, the very assemblage of forces in one great whole, which takes place more or less in all wars, indicates an intention to strike a decisive blow with this whole, either voluntarily as assailant or constrained by the opposite party as defender. So this doesn't really matter, right? There is, even in here, von Clausewitz has more sympathy for the attack than for the defense, right? But it's here the thing now, the whole dialectic of war, if we could talk in these terms, especially from a strategical point of view, has something to say about it, because there are two different forms of war, in a way. But for now, he will discuss it further, not now. Then he writes, when this great blow does not follow, so when we probably do not manage to employ all these forces, then some to deliver that blow, by the way, because that's the ultimate thing. It's not just about gathering, this is not a principle of mass, simply. It's probably the idea that you have to strike in concentrated mass, which means that for the rest of the campaign, is concerned, you could even just have all your force scattered elsewhere. That individually, that would be a problem on a smaller scale as well. So technically, you should always concentrate masses for the objective, however, still of destructing the enemy forces. So that's another modifying effect, that is how to do it, for example. Because if you want to surround, as we'll see, an enemy now delivering a higher blow, like you're basically separating the mass. So as you see here, the thing gets interesting. So however this happens, it says, then some modifying and retarding motives have attached themselves to the original motive of hostility, and they have weakened, altered, or completely checked the movement. But also, even in this condition of mutual inaction, which has been the keynote in so many wars, the idea of a possible battle serves always for both parties as a point of direction. Right? This is interesting. It's as if the whole logic of war was, underlay this main goal, right? A distant focus in the construction of their plans. It's like a compass, right? You know that theoretically you should arrive to that big engagement, and you should prove at that point to be the stronger. Right? Also, intentionally speaking, think about it. What are you fighting for otherwise? That's what we often exclude, the motivation of this all. Right? What do you motivate people? Just to remain at war for all your life? It's obvious that you want to get it done with the quicker, the more quickly it is. And that's why the attacker, generally speaking, has the most positive reason in military terms to act, while the defender doesn't, at least at the moment. So, anyhow, I'm just, making references to the difference between attack and defense because it fascinates me, but this is not the time. It's not the time yet. So, von Clausewitz writes, the more war is war in earnest. Beautiful way of phrasing it. So, are we serious about this? Are we making war, or what? Right? Are we here? This is how we have, in part, you see, in our culture, in part either idealized, romanticized from one side, from the other, blamed and demonized war, because this is objectively the only two positions you hear around, and in fact we have forgotten what war is. Von Clausewitz tells us, the more war is war in earnest, that is to say, you really want to destroy the enemy forces, and you must really want that. And that's what we often forget, that war is not a cultural thing. War is not a decision arbitrarily taken by some crazy person, without an entire systems actually wanting and being fully responsible for it. This is the most difficult thing, that we have been erased from our mind. That is to say, war is just bad, and whenever you talk about it, you should be very careful. Why? We are constantly at war in everything in our life, and this thing teaches us how we should deal with the thing. That is, either you get it done immediately, or you avoid senseless losses due to the fact that you're fundamentally undecided and you don't even understand what you have to do, right? Or you give it up, right? Everything would be really dramatically easier, more humanitarianly positive at so many levels. It says, the more it is a venting of animosity and hostility, right? And this is the point. The more war is war in earnest, and the more what drives us in terms of animosity and hostility, the more we have the reason for doing it, right? A mutual struggle to overpower, so much the more will all activities join deadly contest, and also the more prominent in importance becomes the battle, right? Then von Clausewitz writes, so, and consequently you understand what it means in here. The more the battle becomes the mean of resolution for this, the more the clash, the more the struggle becomes factually the moment in which you can get it done with, right? And this is beautiful in many ways to realize, because you understand there is a way out, properly speaking. It's not just a matter of, personal opinion, practically speaking. So von Clausewitz says, in general, when the object aimed at is of a great and positive nature, One therefore in which the interests of the enemy are deeply concerned, the battle offers itself as the most natural means. It is therefore also the best, as we shall show more plainly hereafter, and as a rule, when it is evaded from aversion to the great decision, punishment follows. Right? You can't pretend to go at war with someone, and this is what I always tell you, but it's so dramatically effective. Imagine you're having an argument with someone, because that's something that we all know what it is, right? So think about it. You go for it to deliver the final blow, or if you waver, or if you retreat, or there's something that doesn't make you deliver that entire force that you should have planned actually to have been decisive in the first place, not only you stop, but the enemy strikes on you, right? Punishment follows. So you probably lose something, and this cannot be concealed, right? It's something it's not a matter of how you of perspective or how you see the thing. It's really about the fact that you have lost something concretely, quantifiably, morally, physically, and there is at that point, the hard lesson of it. Von Clausewitz writes, the positive object belongs to the offensive. As we have seen, the attacker owns not only the positive motive, but also, however, it's the weaker side, at least the weaker form of war, compared to defense, at least. And however, therefore, the battle is also more particularly his means. That is to say, the attacker is usually more willing to come to the big clash, right? He who starts the thing usually wants to get it done earlier than the other, and to do it by means of this attack. This is particularly important, but without examining the conception of offensive and defensive more minutely here, you see also von Clausewitz was wanting for this now, but it says, we'll do it later. We must still observe that even for the defender, in most cases, there is no other effectual means with which to meet the exigencies of his situation, to solve the problem presented to him. That is to say, it's not that you can't also, if you're attacked and you don't want to fight, it's not also at that point that you can't do much to avoid that, right? You have to think in terms still of the great battle, because that's fundamentally what the combat, what war will bring you to. You have to fight, and you have to think of the combat in those terms, because the enemy has already his forces there, or has already decided it's going to do that, and you can't simply slip away from not giving ground, and therefore losing, fundamentally. Up to a certain point, at a point at which you can't tolerate, so you have to fight even in that sense. So defense, of course, does not exclude in any way the necessity of, the possibility of avoiding the battle per se, as a mean of combat, as a mean of resolution of the war. Also, von Clausewitz writes, the battle is the bloodiest way of solution. True, it is not merely reciprocal slaughter, he writes, and its effect is more a killing of the enemy's courage and the enemy's soldiers, as we shall see more plainly in the next chapter, but still blood is always its prize. In slaughter, its character as well as name. Schlacht, from Schlachten, to slaughter, right? The German has this beautiful etymology attached to the term, right? From this, the humanity in general minds recoils with horror, right? So this is important because as you remember from the beginning of the Vom Kriege, the objective of war is to compel the enemy to fulfill your will. So technically, it's not important if you harm him physically, in theory. You can convince someone without resorting to physical violence. But the point is that in war, like in huge masses of men put in motion by political direction, society, and so on, what maybe in an argument used as an adjective would mean, the derogatory adjective would be 10,000 dead if it was 2 states instead of 2 people to quarrel, right? So that's the mechanism through which you say that you can't do this without blood, and this is what von Clausewitz says, right? You can't think of war without thinking of the means of destroying the enemy in that sense, right? Now he passes to the perspective of the general and says, here, among the various things that mitigate this, but there is the problem that the general here is overloaded with responsibility and looks at bloodshed also as one of the, modifying factors. Says, he's horrified, and this can influence his conduct, and it's important to assess in a theory of the art of war because it really has a weight, humanly speaking. In fact, von Clausewitz writes down this psychological perspective, but the soul of the man trembles still more at the thought of the decision to be given with one single blow. That is to say, it's not about much, looking at people horribly, torn apart and so on, all this, the gruesome stuff of war. But it's properly the weight of the decision to give battle, especially with a single blow, right? As we've seen, the responsibility is concentrated in a way that an individual can hardly bear, and that's also why commands have this dramatic role in war that is drastically overlooked in terms of it's all about the soldier that fights in the trench. It's really not, right? The person that suffers the most is really the one that has this devastating psychological responsibility, that exactly because he will not be necessarily blown apart by a shell, will have to live with all his life with, right? It sounds very cynical, but paradoxically, here, was the luckiest in a defeat of that sense? It's very difficult to properly stress in some way, to determine actually, and to even point out as a question, because once again, our culture seems to have interiorized so much that, the generals are just a bunch of corrupted idiots just stay there, do nothing but the soldiers die, right? While war is completely the other way around, in the sense that the soldiers are obviously not much idiots, at least in the terms of, in commanding terms, they basically are, because most of the troop is not minimally required to just obey. But the point here is that what properly wakes on the commander is what decides the whole thing, and it must be considered as one of the most strategical factors involved in here, or beyond strategically speaking, because strategic is eventually the decision that will follow, but properly in terms of command, you must know that this happens, and it's no joke. And he says this single blow should be delivered in one point of space and time, where all action is here pressed together, right? And at such a moment, there is stirred up within us a dim feeling as if in this narrow space all our forces could not develop themselves and come into activity, as if we had already gained much by mere time, although this time owes us nothing at all. This is all mere illusion, but even as illusion is something, and the same weakness which seizes upon the man in every other momentous decision may well be felt more powerfully by the general, when he must take interests of such enormous weight upon one venture. What he's saying here, something very interesting actually, that is about the tendency, once you have come to the point, to say, okay, but we arrived to the big decision, but let's take it easy, right? It's like when someone points a gun at you, right? You freak out, and you say, well, let's negotiate a little bit. Von Clausewitz says, at that time is, if you have a gun yourself, it's when you should pull the trigger, or at least to act more decisively, more directly, whatever your objective really was, and not to, be shooed away by these mere pressure, right? So that you can't think as a general, okay, we brought these troops on the field, okay, the enemy looks impressive, let's wait a second and see what happened. No, that's when you should properly press the hardest, especially when the enemy is also not doing. Of course, there are many ways in which this can again be modified. That is, there's a way even to fight battle, technically speaking, that may require that waiting to happen, of course. But it's not a question of whether you should idle or or not, right? It's properly, you have to take action. At that point, you must do the thing and not remain paralyzed by the difficulty in itself. And this goes beyond, because it says, thus then statesmen, right here from strategy it passes to politics, of course, in the connection that exists in this regard, in the instrumental relation between politics and war. In generals and generals too, so statesmen and generals have at all times endeavored to avoid the decisive battle. This happened quite often, actually. I was just reading about that yesterday, a battle from 1324. You discover, yeah, these guys hated each other guts, but before battle we're saying, okay, but do we really have to do it, right? Is there something else we can negotiate? And this is important because naturally there may be reasons not to, right, politically speaking, not to do it. Because once again, this is all theory of the art of war, but it has nothing to do with whatever the motivation is about. That may have changed, for example, right? So it's a very risky bet in the, in this business of war, as von Clausewitz has defined it with the commercial metaphor of it, of the transaction, the negotiation, the exchange. And Clausewitz writes, writers on history and theory have then busied themselves to discover in some other feature in these campaigns not only an equivalent for the decision by battle which has been avoided, but even a higher art. In this way, in the present age it came very near to this, that a battle in the economy of war was looked upon as an evil, rendered necessary through some error committed, a morbid paroxysm to which a regular prudent system of war would never lead. Only those generals were to deserve laurels who knew how to carry on war without spilling blood. And the theory of war, a real business for Brahmins, was to be specially directed to teaching this. Right? This is heavy talk, because he is referring, of course, to the usual maneuvering of obsession of the 18th century, right? At least on campaign to avoid the confrontation and so on, for reasons that were conservative, and that had roots naturally in the politics of the time, but that military historians and theorists had, exchanged, as von Clausewitz is telling us, for something positive in strictly military terms, which was not, right? As if the wars had become a matter for Brahmins, as if, this was just about, not spilling blood, a humanitarian, almost religious thing, and not properly a military one, for the matter that, for how the matter required, right? So this is a serious problem, because it in many ways it happens still today, or it if you could say it even happens especially today. In fact, now von Clausewitz also writes something very interesting that he doesn't quite phrase in the term that would be best fitting for looking at our world right now, but that inherently is, right? That is to say, he says it a little bit later, but this is a wall complaint, and this is very fascinating. So it says, not only the conception of war, but experience also leads us to look for a great decision only in a great battle. So here he begins again, but says, from time immemorial, only great victories have led to great success on the offensive side in the absolute form, on the defensive side in a manner more or less satisfactory. Even Bonaparte would not have seen the day of Ulm unique in its kind if he had shrunk from shedding blood. Right, it is rather, what Ulm was fought like. It was this great, run for time that, the French army appeared out of the Schwarzwald, the flank of the Austrians. So it was a, properly getting there to annihilate at the moment, not even giving the time to the enemy to react. In fact, the enemy partially retreated as well. Trying to, because it was puzzled, right? And it is rather to be regarded as only a second crop from the victorious events in his preceding campaigns. It is only bold, rash, and presumptuous generals who have sought to complete their work by great venture of decisive battle, but also fortunate ones as well, and we may rest satisfied with the answer which they have thus given to this vast question. So here is actually saying, secondarily, that, of course, it's not just about militarily speaking, you're good just because you search for battle immediately, right? You can maybe do it and even win, but maybe you're just lucky, right? And there is a factor in surprise in this broader time dimension that plays something there. But of course, there is much more to war that to be added in the conduct of war, to be added to make it a sensible thing. But then he comes back on the point, says, "Let us not hear of generals who conquer without bloodshed. If a bloody slaughter is a horrible sight, then that is a ground for paying more respect to war, but not for making the sword we wear blunter and blunter by degrees from feelings of humanity, until someone step in what one that is sharp and lops off the arm from our body." This is a phrase that should be sculpted everywhere. I will reread it because it's also very beautiful, linguistically speaking. "Let us not hear of generals who conquer without bloodshed. If a bloody slaughter is a horrible sight, then that is a ground for paying more respect to war, but not for making the sword we wear blunter and blunter by degrees from feelings of humanity, until some one steps in with one that is sharp and lops off the arm from our body." I don't think I have to explain this for you, right? But this is right. This is the genius of the man, right? Even if the concept is simple, right? But as we have seen, we are at this point 1 year and a half from where we commenced to comment the Vom Kriege, and we have seen demonstrated step by step why this is the case, and not just a matter of moral arbitrum, as people presume it is. I can tell you, in a broader Western context, we to have been raised with the idea that war is should be reduced to a minimum in this sense, right? For no apparent justification, because this becomes eventually a moral problem, right? War and politics and ethics are two separated things, but that's exactly the point. We should face, just conceptually speaking, that you're not automatically bad because you use violence. You should see why you have used it and especially how also, because there could be a situation, maybe you wouldn't think it would require violence, but it could be also modeled in different ways. Think about generally speaking, the enormous debates on whether to go to war or not in this or that country, how to do it. There's an enormous range of possibilities, also just in the modalities in which you do it. You don't have to start from the assumption, okay, we don't have to use violence, we don't have to go fight abroad anymore. Well, why? What's the intelligence in this thought? It's like a mental castration. It's like the reduction of your intellectual faculties to actually solve complex systems. Why would you be so radical? And this is in fact, what many ways I think an intellectual regression of the masses has come to, or better, the emergence of masses that are completely unaware of this problem have always been, and that now pretend to make it a democratic point where, on the contrary, it's a very undemocratic way of reasoning to presume that the use of violence by itself is something negative by default. It's not. It is to be determined case by case. Okay, so von Clausewitz goes on and says, "We look upon a great battle as a principal decision, but certainly not as the only one necessary for a war or a campaign. Instances of a great battle deciding a whole campaign have been frequent only in modern times. This is true. Those which have decided a whole war belong to the class of rare exceptions." Right? This is very important. It's actually the point I was making before. I don't remember which word we were talking about, but it was before, I think, before we were reading. In fact, think about a war that has been actually decided by a battle. We have also seen what is the decisive battle. That is not to say, from that battle onwards, the war was lost. It's a very deterministic thinking. There are just a series of important battles that all together bring to the end, but not even the greatest battles ever fought in mankind were decisive, usually. right? And this is also another idea. It's also sometimes just a dialectical thing. This using, peremptory judgments, apodictic judge. That's a decisive battle. Right? Why should it be, name me a battle that concretely brought to the end of the war? Because as long as there is another battle afterwards, you can be sure that evidently, by self-definition, it wasn't decisive. Right? Because what has it decided, actually? But unfortunately, we fall, especially in this field, in deterministic thinking much more than we do, right? I think, strangely enough, masses have, I don't know how much vaccine from, I think there is a fair share of people who actually realize that we can't be deterministic about everything that happens. Usually younger people are more deterministic, as I, in fact, were, as I was, even just up to a relatively few time ago. But still the concept that is very journalistic, right, very, documentary-like, disclosure-like, that a battle is decisive, right? It's driving away the people from making them understand what the significance of that battle concretely was in the whole strategic picture. Von Clausewitz, do you know how we said it many times, how he addresses the thing? The only decisive battle of a war is the last, which sounds provocatory, but it actually is not, because logically speaking, that's exactly the point. Until there is a battle that puts an end to the thing, you can't say, you will say, well, but that's not necessarily decisive for the war. The point that after a battle that you would think is decisive, there is another battle, should demonstrate the fact that that battle was not decisive. The first one was not decisive. Because decisive means that it settles the thing by itself, and it doesn't. There can be determined, can be turning points at some levels, but still, even the concept of turning point is not even much about necessarily the exchange that is happening between the two contenders, right? But rather, maybe a turning point in the sense that from that moment onwards, the contended was still, was getting under, right, in some ways, but was not over yet, and still thought could make something about the thing, right? So, for example, that's usually the things I say. Think about, Midway or Stalingrad or other. Those weren't. Many people say, those are decisive battles of wars. They actually weren't, right? Properly, Stalingrad and Midway, taken individually, have nothing to do with deciding the end of the war, and not just because the war went on, but also because properly the war was already lost by the Germans 1 year before Stalingrad, and Japan had never had an option to actually win alone the war against the United States since the very beginning. Right, so, and that could hope in some other international change at that level, but the point is that those battles individually had a huge importance. Hell, Stalingrad is the greatest battle ever fought, numerically speaking. Or, I think it may actually not be the case. It's another operation in the Eastern Front that is underestimated. But still, it was something devastating in the term of the sheer destruction, even just the masses employed, the dead, and so on. But properly, it didn't have much to do with the end of the war as we know, right? If it had been won, it could have changed a lot, but that lot would have still not been enough to win the war. You understand what we mean? And here there is a huge debate, because I'm sure many of you say, oh, well, had Stalingrad fallen to the Germans completely, well, the Soviets were out of the war. Well, actually, there is a huge debate about this, right? It's not so. I can tell you because, albeit I'm not an expert, I've been among experts of that field, and they've explained me precisely why it's not the case. But we'll talk about it at some point. We'll have to expand in contemporary warfare and give you some perspective on it. So another thing here, well, the beauty of the phrase even here is astonishing, right? For Clausewitz goes on and says, a decision which is brought about by a great battle depends naturally not on the battle itself, that is, on the mass of combatants engaged in it, and on the intensity of the victory, but also on a number of other relations between the military forces opposed to each other, between the states to which these forces belong, but at the same time that the principal mass of the force available is brought to the great duel. A great decision is also brought on, the extent of which may perhaps be foreseen in many respects, though not in all, in which, although not only one, still the first decision, and as such, has an influence on those which succeed. So, this is important and explains also why it is not always the case that it's not much about the blood in itself, but more as a consequence, as an unavoidable consequence, but not properly the point of the thing. The great battle has this dramatic importance, not because of the destruction in itself, but because of the moment of the decision that it represents. Trying to explain it better, the fact that you have brought in the first place all those forces in there will have a dramatic impact on the as a concept in the aftermath of the battle, because that's what, as we've seen, will shock tremendously the will to fight, both for the both contenders, however it goes, right? And it can even overinflate, just even if it is not even a terrible bloodbath, even if the battle after all is has relatively contained losses, still the defeat deriving from the defeat outcoming, let's say, from combat, can have this enormous influence on the moral of the force that has to keep on fighting, because at that point you realize that if that was the best you could do, and you still failed, but it was not something properly tactically catastrophic, but still, you should think twice now about continuing the war, because, okay, that might have been an unlucky shot, but still, that was perhaps your best option, and you still failed. So that has a dramatic moral impact that not even just the physical loss is a big deal about, right? What is important in an argument for you? Or in a fight, in a duel, whatever you want to think it like, how much you lose temporarily from a physical point of view, it can be devastating at the same time, but properly the psychological impact that the thing has on you. It's obviously mostly about the second one, right? And even for extremely stupid things, you can be, unnerved or, triggered and so on. Just imagine what it means for an entire state to lose its army in the field. And think of how history changes accordingly in this sense. There is here, I don't remember if we have read it actually, but at the same time, principal mass of the force available is brought to the great duel. The great decision is also brought on, the extent of which may perhaps be foreseen in many respects, though not in all, and which, although not only one, still is the first decision, and as such has an influence on those which succeed. Therefore, a deliberately planned great battle, according to its relations, is more or less, but always in some degree, to be regarded as the leading means and central point of the whole system, right? And regarding what we've just said about the consequences of it, you understand why it is the case. Because that is what is properly going to shatter the will of the enemy to fight. So that the destruction of his armored forces in there is obviously aimed at destroying them concretely, but it's mostly connected to disable his mind in the function of fighting further. That makes the point. And of course, as long as you keep having means, you can also try to wear out the enemy without even fighting. But at that point, it would be to leave the initiative to him in a way, and therefore also to lose on your side, and starting to actually passing to it's very rare, you see, to find a clash in this sense, in which you want to use violence, and the person that fights back doesn't have any hope to react, right? It's very rare to find, especially the greater the duel, that is, the war fundamentally is. So as we've seen, what does this mean in practice? In practice, it means that wars are usually fought in a fashion that which the odds are balanced since the beginning, right? If someone plans to lose, where he doesn't go to war at all, he tries another settlement, whatever it is, right? So given that the odds are so balanced, in this sense, it's also likely that if the attacker is simply trying to wear out the attacked, the defender, presuming that he will, at that point, he will not strike back and becoming potentially offensive in that sense, will lose a lot of ground that could be actually even enough to make him himself lose the war. So you see how this is often not negotiable, this is often not really avoidable at the same time. So this is also particularly important because it makes you realize that you can't look at war as if it was like a scientific experiment where the enemy is doing weird stuff and you just observe doing nothing. You're directly involved, and the greater the chances are you're gonna win, or to make what is enough to at least to hope to win, is to be fully involved in the thing, and you're not just passively observing or statically observing. You're taking action to destroy the living thing, right? So this is really, really important because it's really the element, the mutton that often lacks in the broader building of our understanding of war at a popular level in our culture, in our general imaginary. That's probably what war is. War is moral force, is someone that has a freaking reason for wanting to fight. And you can imagine which are the reasons you employ if you want to fight. They're a pretty important one, whichever they are. Even if you're a sick, twisted maniac that just wants to keep up, that's still a freaking strong moral force that you put in it. And someone has to stop you in that sense with something that is able to match it, right? So this is what the entire world is fundamentally about, right? It's just we were constantly told everything goes fine and so on, but there are enormous interests all the time conflicting, and we live within them, within this reality that would be much more easily understood if we cared about these aspects. For Clausewitz writes, the more a general takes the field in the true spirit of war, as well as of every contest, with the feeling and the idea, this is the conviction that he must and will conquer, the more he will strive to throw every weight into the scale in the first battle. Hope and strive to win everything by it. Right? So you should really start with, if you presume to win a war, with the intention that the first blow is actually the most important, right? The first impact, the first glimpse, let's say, what you can foreshadow, let's say, to the enemy, what can happen to him if he just puts himself against you, is what you should be concerned with since the beginning. You can start the war, let's begin a ballet, right? It's first, I let you strike first. That's weak. That's useless, that's dangerous, that's harmful, right? You have to deliver, ideally, the greatest force you're capable of in that context. And once again, your motivations and the world of reality will mitigate that, but still, tendentially, you should push for it, right? And it's obvious that if there's not a reason, there's not a motivation, there's not a political reason for most things that happens in today's world, nobody will do much, right? Was, for example, in today's world, fortunately, the need to start World War III. There is not. We live in a world in which everything is dramatically more, fluid and, maybe locally it's very intense, but it's still something that there is no, underlying reason to destroy the world in a great, gigantic fight. Well, 80 years ago, it existed, and even before, and so just reflect about the fact that this theoretically can happen too at one point again, but still being realistic about why and how, and that's why understanding politics is all that matters if you really want to understand anything about war, by Clausewitz in definition. Makes this example, says Bonaparte hardly ever entered upon a war without thinking of conquering his enemy at once in the first battle. Right, pretty good historical example, and this is actually true. And Frederick the Great, although in a more limited sphere, of course he had way less means at his disposal, even compared to his own enemies, and that was exactly the point of it, that increased the need for him to do that, because otherwise Prussia would have been wiped out. And with the interests of less magnitude at stake, right, in relative terms, right, though the same when at the head of a small army he sought to disengage his rear from the Russians and the Federal Imperial Army. So it's obvious that's why Prussia had been forged in that way, historically speaking. That is, it was fundamentally it was a second-rate power, but he had to struggle, in fact, in emerging to, reality was pressed between France, Russia, Austria, that were first-class powers, and therefore he had to dramatically increase its quality. How does it happen? Was it just technique? It was mostly about moral forces, about this deep convictions that was really about survival of the country, that for a couple of times actually could have been simply wiped out by the French or the Russians, but for political reasons they let them go, right? So at that point the military instrument was not even enough for Prussia. It just depended on the international political situation. So this is very fast, but still the Prussians in those wars showed the world what an army that was properly motivated and trained could achieve, and which had never been seen. And this was translated at a strategical level also in this constant offensive at some point. First move against Austria, invade Saxony. It's the first move always, and then attack into Silesia and Bohemian. So just but for thinking how there was no option, right? It was all very mechanically, like either they did that or there was no other option, right? And there is neither the idea of simply entrenching you within your own country, presuming that will save you, right? And it wasn't true at the time. Today is even less true, right? Also because our armored systems are basically, there is, the componentistics that it needs to work now, the materials, the materiality, the technologies, the know-how is dispersed all over the world, so that no country has within itself all what is needed to lead a world by itself, practically, and that everything is structured considering the international political situation, right? And there would be lots of examples. That is to say, sometimes you can't do without. Think about how every country in the world started World War II. There was no country in the world, not even one, that started that war prepared for it, right? Not even the Germans, that had still, the best armored forces produced at that point, but they still were dramatically unprepared for war. But still, you have to do it in some moment, at least, for what's the Nazis thought they had to do it, and sometimes you can't really decide either, right? So there is a lot to stress in this regard about the needs, the cold needs of war that have nothing to do with a war gamistic, let's say, optional attitude that's okay, we'll try to do this or that, let's see what comes out. No, you can't do that when you're at the end of an army or a country. It doesn't work by that, right? And often you're constrained by things that you can't even properly control, especially if you're a military commander. Politician has more room for maneuver, but not always. And that is still depending, in part, naturally, on the military side of the story. Then von Clausewitz writes, the decision which is given by the great battle depends, we have said, partly on the battle itself, that is, on the number of troops engaged, and partly on the magnitude of the success. How the general may increase its importance in respect to the first point is evident in itself, and we shall merely observe that according to the importance of the great battle, the numbers of cases which are decided along with it increases, and that therefore generals, who confident in themselves have been lovers of great decisions, have always managed to make use of the greater part of their troops in it without neglecting on that account essential points elsewhere. As regards the consequences, or speaking more correctly, the effectiveness of a victory, that depends chiefly on 4 points. 1. On the tactical form adopted as the order of battle. 2. On the nature of the country. 3. On the relative proportions of the 3 arms. 4. On the relative strength of the 2 armies. Right. So the effectiveness of a victory properly depends on these 4 factors that naturally interplay, and that are not even particularly easy to understand, like to see just historically speaking, right? Most of the battles we study, they're not very clear to us objectively from the past, nor they were to the same people who fought them. Because how just these 4 factors interplayed requires there is no system that can properly calculate it. It's mostly this is the stuff that is calculated and that is studied on history books and pondered in history books, and that's pretty much it. And it's mostly conjectural, and there are theories, and of course we can't recognize the single importance. But to put it in relative terms, it already becomes very difficult, right? Then von Clausewitz writes, a battle with parallel fronts and without any action against a flank will seldom yield as great success as one in which the defeated army has been turned or compelled to change front more or less. In a broken or hilly country, the successes are likewise smaller, because the power of the blow is everywhere less. So here, naturally, the result of a battle is more evident in itself altogether than the causes that brought to it. Alright, generally speaking, von Clausewitz says, of course, a victory, and I can't tell you totally, given that I've been studying for a lot of years now, certain specific battles throughout all the 13th and 14th century, that objectively the greatest victories were the ones achieved through this flank attacks, encirclement, all this stuff. So that is kind of obvious if you think about the reasons that we have seen also in previous chapters why, right? It seems even banal to point out. But one thing is to think about it ideally, and secondly is realizing that is actually a realization deriving from the single examples we have about those battles that we don't know maybe well in the way they were fought, but we simply know that thing was carried out, was achieved, that maneuver, and that consequently this battle had a devastating result for the defeated, for he who had suffered the encirclement, the flanking and so on. So, the outflanking and so on. So, this is generally speaking what matters and what you should be mindful about the battle, that you're there to annihilate the enemy's military forces in practice, right? In theory, it may be more complicated, but still, if you think about how to destroy his army forces, fine. You get the theory. You learn it from the practice. It's in some ways actually the same thing. So there are certain tricks, if you want, about how to annihilate an enemy, right? It's obvious that just encircling or outflanking the enemy is a pretty good way of making it, right? You can't say it's a trick. The point is you don't always have the possibility of carrying that out, like the tactic out. And secondly, you may still it could be more risky, right? It's actually more risky than a conventional battle in terms of how you're going to lead it, how you're going to fight it proper. That is to say, okay, it's just a frontal clash. I know what I can expect from it, at least theoretically, if the enemy is not trying to outflank you. That's what basically everybody's trying to do at that point. But at least you know what to expect from your own forces in that situation. But it's obvious that encirclement or other stuff like that is something that also obliges you, for example, to separate your own forces, and that can be, as we have seen, is generally speaking dangerous, especially in the biggest clash of the war, and that you should be looking for to fight. So that's, as you understand, all very balanced. There is not the easy shortcut from this. There is always, on the contrary, the great difficulty of deciding, even at that point, whether to assume yourself the responsibility as a commander to carry out the tactic or not. Also, so here it says something similar. In fact, a battle with parallel fronts and without any action against flank will seldom yield as great success as one in which the defeated army has been turned or compelled to change front more or less. Right? Rarely. Right? You will, just a battle between two parallel fronts is fundamentally a battle of attrition, which is also what most battles, especially the largest they are, turn out to be. Right, and that's why it's even more amazing when in great decisive battles you're able to carry out the freaking masterpiece by using every possible tactic involved in some ways. So the other thing is the terrain. Says, in a broken or hilly country, the successes are likewise smaller because the power of the blow is everywhere less. Yes, and in fact, this is why mountain fronts, generally speaking, also in wars, are of secondary importance compared to the flatlands, right? Because not because the forces involved may not be important, as a matter of fact, but because in terms of breaking through, there are way less chances from both sides to happen. Von Clausewitz says, if the cavalry of the vanquished is equal or superior to that of the victor, then the effects of the pursuit are diminished, because of course the enemy cavalry is going to possibly gather to counter to assist the retreat of his own army, right? And your cavalry can't maybe push too far, and by that great part of the results of victory are lost, as we've seen, because it's mostly about how many losses you're able to inflict just after combat. That usually has low casualties compared to the ones that will have happen at the end of the day. So finally, it is easy to understand, because of the pursuit, of course, it is easy to understand that if superior numbers are only on the side of the conqueror, and he uses his advantage in that respect to turn the flank of his adversary, or compel him to change front, greater results will follow than if the conqueror had been weaker in numbers than the vanquished. The Battle of Leuthen may certainly be quoted as a practical refutation of this principle, but we beg permission for once to say what we otherwise do not like, nor rule without an exception. Right? This is always valid about the Clausewitzian theory. That is not to say, when he's wrong, you can say it's an exception. No, because it's statistically an exception, and a pretty big one. So it's important in this sense to actually to point it out, and it's an exception that confirms the rule. In all these ways, von Clausewitz continues, therefore, the commander has the means of giving his battle a decisive character. Certainly he thus exposes himself to an increased amount of danger, but his whole line of action is subject to that dynamic law of the moral world. There is then nothing in war which can be put in comparison with the great battle in point of importance, and the acme of strategic ability is displayed in the provision of means for this great event, in the skillful determination of place and time, in direction of troops, and in the good use made of success. But it does not follow from the importance of these things that they must be of a very complicated and recondite nature. Not at all. All is here rather simple. Right? War, generally speaking, is something very simple. It's not easy. Right? The art of combination by no means great. But there is great need of quickness in judging of circumstances, need of energy, steady resolution, a youthful spirit of enterprise, heroic qualities, to which we shall often have to refer. That is to say, if we all know that after all outflanking or making ambushes, attacking from the flank, generally speaking, and is the thing. Why is that? Why don't everybody does it? Well, because the point of getting to the big battle is so complicated and always fruit of somewhat even circumstantial situations. You may not even have the time to be fully prepared for it, and this is what you have to compensate in a sense for on the battlefield. So von Clausewitz then writes, there is therefore but little wanted here of that which can be taught by books, and there is much that, if it can't be taught at all, must come to the general through some other medium than the printer's type. Right, so you can't teach things like energy, steady resolution, youthful spirit of enterprise, heroic qualities of that kind. This is something you're born, let's say, grown with, and war is the testing ground for this. It's the selecting ground in many ways, and this is, in fact, what really brings to the point. Right, great commanders are in this regard, usually emerging from practice. There is a few even the just military academies can do in this sense before people actually go to war, right? So these things cannot be taught by the printers. This is the point von Clausewitz rightfully making. The impulse towards a great battle, the voluntary, sure progress to it, must proceed from a feeling of innate power and a clear sense of the necessity. In other words, it must proceed from inborn courage and from precipitous sharpened by contact with the higher interests of life. Great examples are the best teachers, but it is certainly a misfortune if a cloud of theoretical prejudices come between, for even the sunbeam is refracted and tinted by the clouds. To destroy such prejudices, which many a time rise and spread themselves like a miasma, is an imperative duty of theory, for the misbegotten offspring of human reason can also be in turn destroyed by pure reason. This is particularly important too. Beautiful phrase, this last ones, right? You can't properly think that these aspects do not matter at a point, right? This is all what, it's not just theory of the art of war. This is properly theory of politics, theory of society. Because in parallel, in this other realities, it happens exactly in at least, say, comparable ways, and this realization that moral force is something that you should use to properly fight toward the right direction, that does exist and is showed by experience, by reason, by scientific evidence, becomes a moral imperative that should be properly addressed as such, right? So it's when people get angry, because they discuss about the what something is military speaking correct or not, right? There is someone who's wrong and someone who's right. It's not, or better, they, by various degrees, but there is not two options of which, they're both right, but there is one solution, and that's it. And this is something we should be teaching also our children in the measure in which we presume to address them towards what will be better for them. That is to say, you can't live in a world in which you pretend that after all everybody's opinions matters in the same way. That's, yeah, okay, well, making relativism and deciding everything is the same, it really depends on what's your perspective. No, it doesn't. It depends on what reality is. And the problem is trying to understand reality, but the more effort you make and the more you realize the human mind is designed to understand reality. So if you don't understand certain things, it's not just because, you don't know much about it, but it's probably because you haven't understood the importance of such elements. So for your own life in the world. So it's incredibly important to be consistent when we talk about this stuff, because it's not a game. It's not a moment in which you simply say, well, okay, what I decide by arbitrarily speaking, by quoting one thing without even putting it into context. This stuff takes years and years and years to be seen, to be understood, to be assimilated, right? And just go out there on YouTube and see how, for example, von Clausewitz is dealt with, right? Well, the kind of people, it's not judgments that is, this guy, well, yeah, he doesn't say anything important, says things that by now we have way better understood. What exactly? If you speak like that, it's because you don't know what von Clausewitz is talking about. And do you especially know what all the stuff he's talking about? Because most people don't even know. And it's typical exactly for how von Clausewitz puts here, the misbegotten offspring of a human reason to to simply trick us all the time, But anyhow, we have enough commented this also on other occasions, so I will not start again. Just to make you understand how concretely important it is to understand certain aspects of this all. It is not a matter of personal opinion. This comes from evidence, comes from history, comes from a lot of things that people should have in the first place, and that turns out they don't even care to get. Anyhow, for now we'll stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.